I've always liked this one particular verse, chapter 3, verse 4. It's one of those answers that you can give for some of those folks who they just don't rank high on the smartometer. They're the kind of folks that Psalm 19, I did misquote that, David. I looked it up a while ago. Psalm 14:1, who says, "The fool has said in his heart, there is no God." Now, as I've said many times before, when we're looking at that verse, God is not poking fun at people for their ignorance. He's not denigrating people. He's stating a fact. When you look at the evidences, you have to concede the fact that there is some creator behind everything that we see. And the very simplicity of the concept of a house, seeing a house, and I've heard many guys speak on evolution and the ridiculousness of it, by virtue of the fact it's based on an accident or a bang that happened somewhere with something that they can't explain as to how it came about. And so when we see a house, we know there's a builder involved. But in the context, there's so much more than just the obvious, which is the fact that we know there is an origin or an originator, and that originator is God. But you look at the context that it's in, and it's talking about ourselves as being part of who Christ became as our brother, who he sacrificed himself. He is in perfection as our high priest. And so if you look at how it begins in chapter 3, therefore, holy brethren, his audience in this Hebrew audience, and again we were there this evening like we were this morning, a Hebrew audience that understands the background and the history of the Old Testament people. We are partakers of a heavenly calling because of who Christ is. Now, what Christ has done is what we'll get to in a minute, but who Christ is our high priest. He is an apostle. He is the individual who ought to have more credibility and stand above Moses. And the reason given in verse 3 is that he is higher because he's not the house, he's the creator of the house. I like the analogy that's used and the reason and the example that is used in using a house to describe who we are. In the first place, it's interesting that a house is very basic. Having a shelter over your head, Maslow, a doctor from way back and has some weird and funky ideas about psychology, but he did hit on the fact that there is a pyramid of needs that people have, and one of the high needs that we have is shelter. We need a place that's, called home. It's interesting in this context where he's talking about Moses. If you go back to Psalm 90, this is the song of Moses, or a prayer of Moses, I should say. It's in song form in a psalm. But in Psalm 90, at the very beginning of the psalm, Moses says, "Lord, you have been our dwelling place in all generations." When it comes to security, when it comes to protection from the elements, when it comes to a place, and this may be sentimental, but a place you can call home, Moses was saying, God, you're the one. You are our home. Before the mountains were brought forth, or ever you were formed, or you had formed the earth and the world, even from everlasting to everlasting, you are God. He is the one who built the original house in which we belong, and we can find security and comfort and health and all of the good things that this life has to offer, but in the context of Hebrews, what the next life has to offer. He is our home. He is our security. He is the place we want to go. I've been studying reading a book on government here lately, and it's an interesting thing how our country is so founded in concepts and principles in the Bible, one of which is owning property. Liberty, life, pursuit of happiness, and security in property. There's something about owning property, unlike the communist system, the socialist system. Owning property that kind of defines who we are when you talk about people being free and enjoying the security that life has to offer. You have a property. You have a castle doctrine based on that concept where you can protect what is yours, because what is yours very often defines who you are. In this sense, then, he uses the term house to describe that place of security that we have. And we have that because, as Moses was the house, so we also are part of the house. Peter uses the term in 1 Peter 2:5, talking about ourselves as members of the body of Christ, as living stones. If you look at that in 2 Peter in chapter 2, verse 5, he makes the comment, you also, well, let me go back a verse because it kind of sets the tone. Coming to him as a living stone, rejected indeed of men, but chosen by God and precious. So what we're talking about is coming to Christ and being precious to him. But you also, as living stones, are built up a spiritual house, a holy priesthood, to offer up spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. You know, there's the security we have in this house, but it also carries with it the idea of an approachability to God. If we are a part of a spiritual house, which includes this concept of a holy priesthood, then we're the temple of God, as is explained in 2 Corinthians 6, 14 through 18. We are a temple of God, a house of God, lively stones, and that also carries with it the idea that we have the opportunity, but the privilege is the word I'm looking for, the privilege of going to God. You know, we take it for granted sometimes, I think, the fact that, you know, we're all sitting here this evening, we're worshiping God, we stand up and say a prayer to God, and then we don't think anything of it. Do you realize that's not always the way it's been? People just didn't approach God out of the blue. As a matter of fact, if they wanted to approach God, they went and found them a Levite priest under the Mosaic system, because that Mosaic priest was the one, that Levi was the one who was the go-between, the mediator between God and man. We have it so good today because we are a part of the temple, a house. We can go, because we're holy priesthood, we can go directly to God. There's great privilege that when you compare the two and you look at the correlation between ourselves as a spiritual body being a house, there's a security, but there's also a privilege in approaching God. But not only that, also there's the idea of the product that we are of a master craftsman. Got a book here just lately, and I haven't read it yet. I'm anxious to get into it. It has to do with much of the symbolic nature of the pictures and the things of Masonic Lodge. I don't know how much y'all know about the Masonic Lodge, but it is a religion. And it's interesting, all of the different pictures and things they have that represent something that's supposed to be spiritual and holy. It's interesting to me that as the product of God, we are a spiritual dwelling for God. God lives in us. He dwells in us. As a matter of fact, all of these tangible things that people use so often to represent God, that's who we are. I don't know whether you've ever thought about that or not, but you know, you see the baseball player right before he hits the ball, kisses his little emblem on his chest that he's wearing around his chain, and then he gets up and strikes out, so evidently it doesn't help much. But the point being, we are that symbol in the culture out here. We are that symbol of who Christ is because we are of his house. We represent Christ in this community. When people see us walk up and down the street, and when they talk to us each day, when they are a part of our lives, what they should be seeing is something extremely Christ-like, something that is the product of Jesus Christ. And so therefore, what does Christ make? What kind of house would you say he makes? Now, one thing we do know, and he told his disciples in John 14, when he's going on ahead of us here, as he did, and went up into the heavens, we were told by the angels in Acts 1, why are you staring up there? Because he's coming back just like he left. And what he promised in John 14 is he's going to build us mansions. I've always thought that interesting. You know, with Christ, it's not just a house, it's a mansion he's building for us. I don't know if you've thought about that or not, but you and I, we live in houses, some pretty nice houses, by the way. I've been all over the world and seen what people live in, and we live in some pretty nice houses. But I don't know how many of us could say the house we live in is comparable to or even near a mansion. But that's what Christ is building for us. It's the product of what Christ does for his children. So when you look at, and I'm just not putting any pressure on you or anything, but when you look at who we ought to be because Christ is our builder, what do you think he expects of us? Why, we're the product of Christ. I can understand why Paul just got all over the Romans in chapter 6 after he tells them, don't you know that when you've been baptized into Christ, you've died to yourself, you rise up, you walk in newness of life. And then in verse 21 says, why are you going back to all this stuff you used to do, of which you used to be ashamed of? And rightly so. You should change, you should be different, because right now we are the house of Christ. We are the house of God. We are different than those about us. We have been built by Christ, and the perfection that is needed and expected there is just a reflection of who Christ is. You see in this verse when it says, for every house is built by someone, the generic application of that is, honestly, it's certainly a cause and effect argument for the creation of the universe. It's certainly a cause and effect argument for the skill set we have as humans as opposed to monkeys and all other creation, as God made us unique because He gave us His Spirit. And it's also, evidence of the fact that the church He built is unique and separate from every other organization on the planet. But when you get to start dissecting that church and what He built, that church is you and me. So when we walk through town, when we visit those we see every day, do we reflect the product at that high level that Christ expects? It's a difficult thing when you look at the idea of expectations and where we ought to be. In fact, I think one of the things that it ought to do is keep us incredibly humble. Understanding who we are and the flawed creature that we actually are. It is an honor and a privilege to be called Christ's. Too often it is the case that whatever one does religiously ought to be good enough, or whatever I think is good enough for God should suffice. And those kinds of mentalities are such that they forget who Jesus is and the product that He's made. His house is intended to be perfection. Now, I understand we can't live to perfection and we can't do everything perfectly, but I can tell you this, there is an expectation that we try to be holy because God is holy. We try to change our life to be more like Christ. We use that phrase all the time, but what does that mean? Well, we are the product of what He has built. Now, when we assess ourselves, and we look at ourselves individually, of course, to begin with, it retains quite considerably a challenge to live that way. But let's not forget the corporate application of it. We as the church, here at Park Heights, we as the church are the product of Christ. So we have to ask our question, what part of the house am I? What function do I perform in that house? Where is it that I provide a security, as a house will do, for those who are part of this house? Do I provide something that is essential and needed in someone else's life because I am a part of this house? What service do I render, as does a house in a temporal sense? What do I do as a part of Christ's house that perpetuates safety, security, and all of the things that go with being a part of Christ's house? There's some serious questions perhaps we ought to ask ourselves. And while we can look at this verse and we can understand, yes, if there's a house, there's got to be a builder, and that's a great cause and effect argument for the existence of God. It also, in this context, speaks of how much greater Jesus is than what Moses was. And if you look at Moses, and you look at how, by inspiration, the Bible speaks of Moses, look at the end of the swan song of Moses at the end of Deuteronomy, and ask yourself, because the verse just previous to this in Hebrews, the third verse there in chapter 3, talks about the fact that Moses is so much less, because he's part of the house, than Christ who is the house. Ask yourself if you're on the level of Moses, just to get a scan of where you fall in the spectrum, okay? Where do I fit here? Here's Christ, who is so much greater than Moses, who is a part of this house, and I'm part of this house as a living stone, and do I fit this description? But since then, there has not, I'm reading, by the way, in chapter 34 of Deuteronomy, verse 10. Deuteronomy 34:10. But since this is after Moses had passed on. But since then there has not arisen in Israel a prophet like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face. And all the signs and the wonders which the Lord sent him to do in the land of Egypt, before Pharaoh, before his servants, and in all this land, and by all the mighty power and all the great terror which Moses performed in the sight of all Israel. Where do I fit right there? Am I even in the same pasture as old Moses? And yet Moses was so far inferior to Christ. Here we are, living stones in a production of Christ, what he has produced, what he has built. What a humility we ought to possess, and what a gratitude we ought to exude, because we have the honor and the privilege to be in Christ's house. This gathering here in Park Heights is not just a social affair. It's not just another one of the many religious organizations in town. It's not even a part of just a community here that is an insignificant, small little group. This is a blood-bought house of God. And we need to appreciate that. And we need to show that as lively stones as we walk through this community, as we exude our influence on other people. It is an honor and a privilege to be a member of the Lord's church. If you're not a member of the Lord's church, we always offer an invitation in song. If you have something wrong with your life that has kept you from being the member that you should be, and we can help in some public way, then we invite you as we stand.